This week's picture is of the football stadium on the Ashland campus. SOU has both women and men's intercollegiate athletics, but they're in the NAIA, which is the National Association of Intercollegiate Athletics. There's quite a bit of reading this week, 5 chapters, and then also before you start anything, make sure you read the weekly overview in Moodle, because that'll give you the most up-to-date information on what's due. And then later in the week, make sure you respond to the discussion question. In Foundations of Business Law, Chapter 20, we look at hybrid business forms, the different types of business organizations you can have, and there's different things they talk about in the chapter: limited partnerships, limited liability companies, S-corps, etc. And don't read the cases; they're not required, but do read the summary. It's a really good summary in this chapter, but primarily what you're going to look at on the different organizations, and really what it comes all down to is what types of organization do people want to form their business around, and that has to do with limited liability and limited taxation. If in a partnership, just a straight partnership or a sole proprietorship, you're basically liable. Personally, you can be personally liable unless you're a limited partner. But sole proprietors and general partnerships, you're liable for any problems or malfeasance that may occur. So that's one thing. And then, say for example, with a sole proprietorship, you're taxed on just your regular rate of income. In a corporation, you're taxed on twice, really. You're taxed on your corporate tax base, and then as you distribute the profits, if you're a shareholder, you're also taxed on what kind of income you receive from the corporation. So really look at that. In there, table 20.1 in the summary is a great discussion. If you're pressed for time and you're just need to know the best briefing, look at that table 20.1 in the summary. With Chapter 21, we look at the various aspects of the corporation. They have a lot on the history of the corporation. It's interesting, but again, if you're pressed for time, you might just want to skim that. And you should understand publicly held, closely held corporations, publicly held, a lot of shareholders, closely held, just a few people or a small amount of people hold the shares in the corporation, and there's some differences involved there. And then the corporation as a person, that's where we get down to Citizens United again, and that's where the Supreme Court ruled that the corporation was a person and had the right for free speech, especially with political activities. And then piercing the corporate veil just primarily is what courts do sometimes when they're receiving information on malfeasance or fraud or some sort of problem, and they want to, get through all the protections that a corporation has, which they can get through. And that's what you might have heard about with companies such as Enron and some of the other big financial disasters that we've had in organizational history. and look at nonprofits, the municipal corporation, professional corporations, and then the business corporations. All of them have different aspects and different pros and cons, and all were created and developed for a specific purpose. With the corporate charter, this is kind of your roadmap for your corporation, what you're going to do, how you're going to do it, and when you're going to do it. And then with corporations also, corporations can be created de jure, which is by law, de facto, by the facts of the case. Even though you might claim you're not a corporation, you're acting as a corporation. And then estoppel corporations, which are basically you can't deny that you're not something when you've been doing everything to say that you are that something, where the courts can claim that you're a corporation by estoppel because you've been acting like a corporation. And in this chapter, cases are optional. Read them if you'd like. If you just don't have the time, they're not necessary. With corporate powers and management, be aware of the express and implied powers. Similar to what we've looked at in previous chapters, express powers are what is outlined that you can do specifically, and implied powers are basically what you're expected to do. As I mentioned in the chapter, if you're a bookstore, it's automatically assumed that you'll buy and sell books, hire staff, do advertising, selling books, etc. And then the ultra vires doctrine, corporations have to make sure they're not going beyond the scope of their powers. Both the express and implied powers, you can't go beyond, or the courts and people can take legal action against the corporation. And with shareholders, there's a number of things shareholders can expect, but they basically can expect the right to vote. They can look at all the details and documents of the corporation, and they have, in some cases, preemptive rights that their ownership interests won't be diluted in any way. And now this is changing quite a bit over the course of time, and really depends on the laws of the state where you're incorporated in, or what's outlined in the charter. And derivative actions, shareholders can file suit against the corporation if they feel the board of directors or the management of the corporation isn't taking actions that could be in the best interest of the corporation. And both directors and officers have the duties of loyalty and care. Loyalty, you have to place the organization above your own personal interest, and care is you just have to exercise due diligence and do what basically common sense, what a common person would do to protect and advance the organization. And then later in the history of the corporations and to the present day, we're now looking at that whole concept of corporate social responsibility, which we'll discuss in more detail in some of our other activities. And then Sarbanes-Oxley, we'll see that a little bit more in week number 5. And again, the cases are optional. All right, we're switching now to the business ethics workshop and talking about corporate culture. What is your organization all about? If you were asked that question, what would you say? Would you say we're an innovative organization that really promotes diversity and inclusiveness and new ideas? Or what would you say? And you might have that in your organizational code, which is your mission, values, and what your organization is striving for, what it means to the organization to be successful. And then also your code of ethics, and we'll study code of ethics in more detail in the next several weeks, but what do you expect of your organization in terms of ethical responsibility? And you can do in there, in that chapter, they have the corporate ethics audit, culture audit, and you can go through and answer those questions just to yourself and say, what is your organization all about and what is its culture? And really, a culture is determined a lot by the leadership of the organization. They mention John Buford, who was a Civil War general, and how he kind of went outside the limits of what was required in order to do some things to save the day at Gettysburg. And I'm a big avid reader of Civil War history, so that one struck a really interesting chord with me. Cases are optional in this chapter, but it is a very, very good chapter to read and gets us a start on our ideas on ethics. In business ethics, chapter 8, we're looking at diversity, and there is financial rewards to having a more diverse workplace. There is a diversity dividend, as they point out in the chapter. The more inclusiveness and the more diverse your organization is, probably the more profitable and successful it will be. Also be aware of the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunities Commission, and what they're all about. Also be aware of the American with Disabilities Act and the accommodations that are required, and undue hardship is there if the organization can say that the accommodations would require a hardship for them. There is a possibility that something else could be worked out. There's a chapter on sexual identification and orientation, something that is very commonplace these days, but wasn't so much, say, 40, 50 years ago, and just shows how society is changing, where we're now recognizing different areas of diversity. Also, income inequalities and pay equities. If you remember back to the 1%, 99% sit-ins on Wall Street a few years back, that still is a big issue, and is right now in our political system is kind of a debate question going on at the time. And then use of animals in research. Again, with the whole issue of corporate social responsibility, a lot of companies are really examining what they're doing in terms of animal testing and all. So it just shows you in summary, and there's all these chapters have good summaries in them. In summary, it just shows you the different way that leadership in organizations is changing for the better as we move into the future. Once again, read the weekly overview. It has the most up-to-date view of what the weekly assignments are and when they're due. And then also, please stay current with your assignments. As I mentioned earlier, there's an incredible amount of reading, 5 chapters, but I'm trying to give you as much background as I possibly can so that you can make a good analysis in the different cases that we're going to be doing in the discussion questions that we've been doing, and then also in your research paper. So hopefully you'll become a very, very well-rounded individual. Important to remember what the EEOC is all about and its duties. EEOC is very, very important in your role as a leader in any organization, and it's there really to protect individual rights. So we shouldn't look on it as anything other than a guidance to help us do the right thing.